she stormed onto my lawn, HOA notice in hand, eyes blazing like I'd committed a crime, not pitched a tent in my own backyard. The words she spat felt more like a verdict than a suggestion. Fines, threats, endless rules, designed to control every inch of my life. All I wanted was a quiet weekend under the stars, but suddenly I was trapped in a battle I never asked for, a war over grass, dirt, and freedom. As her voice echoed in my head, I realized this wasn't just about camping. It was about power, control, and how far someone would go to prove they owned me. What would happen if I refused to play by her rules? I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where mornings smelled of fresh, cut grass, and the hum of sprinklers was our unofficial alarm clock. My house wasn't flashy, just a modest home with a small backyard where I loved to unwind after long days, sipping coffee on the porch while watching the kids chase our golden retriever across the lawn. Life felt simple, predictable. The kind of place where neighbors waved and borrowed sugar without hesitation. But beneath the neatly trimmed hedges and painted mailboxes lurked an invisible web of rules and watchful eyes, the kind that could turn friendliness into scrutiny. I had always thought the homeowners association was just a formality, a set of guidelines that mostly went unnoticed, until one seemingly harmless weekend decision would put me directly in the crosshairs of a relentless, controlling figure who saw my backyard, my freedom, and even my happiness as a challenge to her authority. From the moment I received the first official-looking notice, the tension began to coil around me like a steel trap I couldn't escape. At first, it seemed almost comical, an innocuous warning about a temporary structure in my backyard, the little tent I had set up for a weekend camping trip with my kids. I laughed when I read the letter, thinking surely there was some mistake, perhaps an overzealous board member having a bad day. But that laughter evaporated the second notice arrived, firmer in tone, outlining fines and deadlines in intimidating legal jargon that seemed designed to suffocate rather than clarify. The tent, which had felt like a small, innocent escape from the routines of suburban life, suddenly became the focal point of an escalating conflict, a symbol of rebellion in the eyes of a committee that treated every inch of our yards as if it belonged to them. Then came the first encounter with Karen, the unofficial queen of the HOA, the woman whose sharp eyes and pointed tongue had become legendary in our community. She appeared on my doorstep one morning, not with a smile or a greeting, but with a clipboard, a camera, and a tone that suggested I was committing a crime. Every word dripped with authority, every pause felt like a threat, and I realized in that instant that my simple weekend plans had awakened a force I hadn't known existed, one that would stop at nothing to assert control. I tried reasoning, explaining that this was just a family activity, harmless, temporary. But she wasn't listening, she couldn't be. Karen thrived on enforcing rules no one else seemed to notice, rules that she interpreted in ways that benefited her ego and her sense of power. Every attempt at compromise was met with escalating consequences. Fines tripled, deadlines shortened, warnings became inspections, and the small warnings became letters with intimidating legalese, all hinting that refusal to comply would lead to hearings, penalties, even public shaming. I began noticing the subtle ways neighbors who once waved or nodded in passing now avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably when she walked by, aware that dissent could be socially penalized. The tension wasn't just personal. It had begun infecting the entire block, turning casual smiles into cautious glances, creating a subtle, pervasive pressure that made every outdoor activity feel like an act of defiance. Each day brought new absurdities. measurements of my garden beds, to ensure they met exact specifications, questions about the height of my fences, even inquiries into the types of plants I'd chosen, as if every choice I made could be interpreted as a violation. It became clear that this wasn't about tents or fences. It was about control, about someone asserting dominance over spaces that belonged to other people. I started keeping records, photographing everything, noting dates and interactions, because instinctively I knew this could spiral into a legal nightmare. Yet even with evidence, Karen's presence loomed like a storm cloud, unpredictable and merciless, and every conversation seemed to twist my words, painting me as uncooperative, irresponsible, a troublemaker in the eyes of those who deferred to her authority. One afternoon, she appeared again, clipboard in hand, insisting on measuring my lawn to the exact inch, muttering about community standards and aesthetic integrity, and I realized her power wasn't just in rules. It was in fear, in the knowledge that a few words from her could set off a chain reaction of fines, gossip, and social pressure that would make life unbearable. I felt the first sparks of anger, tempered by frustration and disbelief. How could a small patch of grass, a weekend tent, be a battleground? But the rules were clear in her mind, and clarity, I learned, is the weapon of the overzealous. A few arbitrary lines on a sheet of paper could dictate the rhythm of someone else's life, and suddenly I understood that my sense of freedom, my simple joys, were being pitted against her obsession with power. The weeks stretched on, each day bringing new, petty challenges. Letters demanding removal of decorations deemed non-compliant. Threats to fine me for leaving trash bins out even a few hours past the stated time, and repeated inspections that turned my backyard into a stage where I was always under scrutiny. It wasn't just rules. It was harassment, calculated and methodical, designed to wear down resolve and assert dominance without ever appearing overtly malicious. The subtle cruelty of bureaucracy wielded like a weapon. I could see it affecting the family. My kids hesitated before running outside, sensing the tension, and my partner's smile grew cautious, the carefree weekends we once enjoyed now punctuated by anxiety. My own patience frayed, every small victory, like successfully defending a minor violation, felt like a fleeting triumph in a war that had no clear end. And then came the tipping point. An official meeting summoned me before the board, a committee whose decisions had always been opaque, and I entered with a mixture of apprehension and defiance, only to be met with cold stares, pointed questions, and references to clauses I hadn't even known existed. Each argument I made was met with a dismissive glance, or a bureaucratic counter, a reminder that in this world, rules weren't about fairness. They were about enforcing submission. I walked out that day, not only with a formal warning, but with a sense that the fight had escalated beyond anything I had imagined. This was no longer about a tent or a backyard. It was about autonomy, about reclaiming a space that was mine. The next few weeks were a blur of escalating tension. Fines mounted, notices were pinned to my door like battle flags, and neighbors whispered behind hands, as if proximity to the conflict could tarnish them too. I found myself obsessively checking mail, scanning the yard, preparing for inspections that could come at any hour. Each time I thought I had found a loophole, a moment of reprieve, Karen, or someone acting in her stead, appeared, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp, reminding me that in this microcosm, control was absolute and mercy non-existent. I became strategic, documenting everything, recording dates, photographing each notice, each attempt at intimidation, realizing that preparation might be the only weapon left in a conflict that had become absurdly personal. Nights were restless, mind spinning with scenarios, arguments, and counter-arguments. I replayed every interaction, trying to anticipate the next move, knowing that every small misstep could trigger another wave of harassment. And yet, amid the mounting stress, a quiet determination began to form. If this was a war of control, I would not surrender. And if the HOA, or Karen, thought they could dictate my life with threats and fines, they had underestimated the resolve of someone fighting for their home, their family, and their freedom. As tensions peaked, minor victories only fueled the battle. One letter dismissed, a fine reduced. But these were temporary reprieves, punctuated by even more creative tactics from the board. Rules were stretched, definitions twisted, inspections multiplied, and the petty absurdity of it all became almost surreal. At one point, I watched as Karen meticulously measured the spacing between my patio stones, muttering about alignment and community standards, and realized that the fight was no longer logical. It was personal, obsessive, and relentless. I began connecting with other neighbors quietly, sensing that I wasn't alone in experiencing the tyranny of microscopic rules enforced with disproportionate authority, and together we shared stories that mirrored my own tales of arbitrary fines, excessive inspections, and social intimidation. The realization that this wasn't an isolated incident gave me a strange sense of solidarity, even as the immediate threat of the next notice or visit loomed constantly. Then came the moment that crystallized the absurdity of the entire conflict, a minor decoration in my garden. One that added a touch of whimsy for the kids, was labeled a violation of aesthetic compliance. I received a letter with photos, measurements, and citations, the tone bordering on ridicule, as if my sense of joy and individuality was a punishable offense. That's when I understood that this wasn't about the rules. It was about control, about asserting dominance over a space that was mine to enjoy. The frustration bubbled into determination, a growing fire that refused to be smothered by fines or threats. Every petty rule, every intimidating visit, every letter meticulously detailing my supposed failures became fuel for a larger plan, a quiet resolve forming in the back of my mind. If freedom was under siege in my own backyard, maybe it was time to redefine what ownership and independence truly meant. And as the days and weeks stretched on, the tension reached a crescendo, with every glance from Karen, every whispered comment from neighbors, and every official notice reinforcing that the battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes were no longer just a weekend tent. They were the very right to live on my property, without fear or intimidation. Each incident built upon the last, stacking frustration, anxiety, and incredulity into an almost unbearable weight. Yet through it all, a single thought persisted. If surrender was not an option, then the only path forward was to reclaim control, in a way that no petty rule or overbearing neighbor could ever challenge. And just when it felt like the endless cycle of notices, inspections, and intimidation had reached its peak, a whisper of an idea began to take shape, a plan that could turn the tables entirely and transform this relentless pressure into an opportunity for ultimate vindication. But the question remained, gnawing at the edge of my mind, could I really take that step, or was it too outrageous, too risky, too bold for someone like me caught in the web of HOA tyranny? The tension hung in the air, thick and unyielding, a storm waiting to break, leaving the next move uncertain, dangerous, and potentially life-changing. And as I stared at the letters stacked on my kitchen counter, the camera on my phone capturing the growing chaos outside, I realized there was no turning back. The rising action of this conflict had reached a fever pitch, and what came next would redefine everything. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm I could feel in my bones, long before I stepped out the door. I had prepared meticulously, every letter, every notice, every encounter cataloged with timestamps and photographs. Yet, nothing could fully steel me against the feeling of walking into a room where power and intimidation had been rehearsed to perfection. The board members sat like judges of a kingdom I had never asked to join, their expressions cold, unreadable, eyes flicking to notes and screens, as though my mere presence was already a transgression. And then there was Karen, sitting at the head of the table, clipboard clutched tightly, her gaze sharp enough to cut through steel, radiating the satisfaction of someone who believed the outcome had been written before the hearing even began. As I took my seat, a knot of tension coiled in my chest. I could hear the faint scratching of pens, the shuffle of papers, the almost imperceptible whisper of agreements between those who had already chosen sides. The first words came from the chairperson, polite but icy, a statement that framed the entire discussion in terms of community standards, non-compliance, and repeat offenses, as if my very life had been a pattern of defiance that required correction. Karen leaned forward, her voice rising like a tide, enumerating the supposed infractions with precision. Tent in the backyard, decorations outside of approved specifications, minor deviations in landscaping. And each accusation landed with the weight of absurdity, yet carried the authority of enforceable consequence. I felt a surge of anger, a mix of disbelief and defiance, and I realized that all the documentation, all the careful records, were not just tools for defense. They were weapons, shields against an onslaught that had grown increasingly personal, punitive, and relentless. As Karen spoke, I could see the subtle smirks from some board members, the quiet nods, the way they seemed to relish this display of control. And it became clear that this confrontation was about far more than the rules themselves. It was about the thrill of domination, the power to dictate someone else's life under the guise of legality. My hands trembled slightly as I rose to speak, not out of fear, but out of the sheer force of adrenaline that comes when one knows the stakes are impossibly high. I laid out my case calmly, methodically. Copies of correspondence, photographs showing compliance, examples of vague or contradictory rules, and the documentation of the constant harassment that had escalated far beyond any reasonable measure of authority. Each piece I presented was met with a brief pause, an exchange of glances, and then a rebuttal that twisted words or invoked obscure clauses I had never read, a tactic that seemed designed to exhaust my patience and paint me as belligerent. And yet, beneath the tension, I felt a simmering confidence growing. A quiet, resolute belief that I was not in the wrong, that the absurdity of their actions was its own undoing, that every overreach could be exposed if I just held steady. Then came Karen's most audacious move. She presented a new claim, one I had never anticipated, alleging that my entire backyard setup violated not just a guideline, but an interpretation of community standards so subjective it defied reason. My pulse quickened, the room seemed to shrink, and I felt the familiar surge of frustration and disbelief, yet alongside it came clarity. This was the moment, the peak of intimidation, the point where either I yielded or I turned the tide entirely. I leaned forward, voice steady despite the tremor in my chest, and delivered a counter move I had been refining in my mind for weeks. I challenged the legality of her interpretations, citing statutes, homeowner rights, and precedents that made clear the board's authority had limits that even Karen could not override. I presented evidence showing selective enforcement. Other neighbors had similar setups with no reprimand. and highlighted inconsistencies in inspections and citations. The room seemed to shift subtly, a faint murmur rippling among board members as they realized this was no ordinary resident quietly accepting penalties. Karen's eyes narrowed, her confidence flickering for the first time, and a tension-filled silence stretched across the room, broken only by the subtle shuffle of papers and the whispered exchange of words between those who had relied on her certainty as a shield of authority. Every word I spoke carried the weight of weeks of frustration, sleepless nights, and simmering indignation. Every example, every reference to law, chipped away at the veneer of her dominance, exposing the vulnerability beneath the mask of control. Then came the moment of highest drama. I unveiled photographic and documented proof of procedural errors, selective application of rules, and her own admissions in prior notices that contradicted her current stance. The room seemed to hold its breath as board members absorbed the evidence, the murmurs growing louder, a ripple of doubt spreading through the ranks. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers clutching the edge of the table as if anchoring herself against the tide I had unleashed. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a mix of disbelief, tension, and the intoxicating sense that the battle had suddenly shifted. I could feel her frustration radiating like heat, her posture rigid, her eyes darting as she realized that the meticulous web of intimidation she had woven for weeks was unraveling before her. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The room, once a fortress of authority aligned against me, had become a stage for vindication, the evidence and the sheer force of persistence turning the power dynamic on its head. And just as I felt the smallest flicker of triumph, the chairperson raised a hand, calling for a recess to review the new material, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. A pause pregnant with possibility, where victory and setback hovered on a knife's edge. In that pregnant moment, I realized that while I had struck a decisive blow, the final outcome was still uncertain, the resolution still pending, yet the shift in energy was undeniable. The once unshakable Karen, whose every glance had been an instrument of intimidation, was now visibly rattled, forced to reckon with the consequences of a resident unwilling to be cowed. The tension was electric, the room filled with the unspoken acknowledgement that the narrative had changed, that I was no longer a passive target of harassment, but a participant actively shaping the battle. And as I stepped back from the table, documents in hand, the weight of anticipation pressing against my chest, I knew that the climax had been reached, the highest point of emotional intensity and confrontation achieved, leaving only the aftermath, the resolution, and the ultimate vindication yet to unfold. But the first spark of triumph had been lit, and it was one that no petty rule, fine, or overbearing neighbor could ever extinguish. The tension from the hearing lingered long after I left the boardroom, an invisible weight pressing down with every step across my front lawn. But there was a subtle shift in the air that I could feel. An acknowledgement, quiet but undeniable, that the battle had taken a turn. In the following days, the HOA board, now forced to revisit their procedures in light of the evidence I had presented, began a slow, almost grudging process of reconsidering the fines, citations, and arbitrary rules that had been used to harass me for weeks. Notices were rescinded, deadlines erased, and for the first time in months, the backyard, the very place that had become a battleground, felt like mine again. Karen, whose presence had once loomed over every corner of my property, was suddenly constrained by the very regulations she had tried to weaponize. Her authority, once absolute in its subtle terror, had been tempered by exposure, by the undeniable clarity of documentation and the resolve of someone unwilling to be bullied. I watched as neighbors, who had quietly witnessed the ongoing tension, began to return, some offering nods, others tentative smiles. The subtle shift in social dynamics, a reflection of the change in power that had been set in motion. The experience had not only redefined my own sense of autonomy, but had also revealed the cracks in a system that had seemed invincible, showing that persistence, preparation, and courage could overturn even the most entrenched structures of petty authority. With the immediate threats neutralized, I turned my attention to reclaiming the joy and freedom that had been eroded over months of scrutiny and intimidation. The backyard, once a place of anxiety, was transformed into a space of celebration. The tent, no longer a source of conflict, but a symbol of resistance and resilience, a place where evenings were again filled with laughter, the smell of campfires, and the thrill of simple pleasures that no rule or overbearing neighbor could erase. Beyond the personal victory, I began to notice subtle, longer-term effects in the community itself. Other residents, emboldened by the visible pushback, started questioning petty fines, speaking up at meetings, and documenting their own interactions with the HOA. The culture of fear that had quietly governed the neighborhood for years began to loosen, revealing that the true power had always resided in the collective willingness to stand up against unreasonable authority. I realized that the ripple effect of one person's refusal to accept intimidation could extend far beyond a single backyard, reshaping social dynamics and inspiring others to reclaim agency over their own spaces. Yet, the journey was not without emotional residue. The months of stress, sleepless nights, and constant vigilance had left their mark, teaching lessons about patience, strategy, and the importance of standing firm even when the odds seemed stacked. I found myself reflecting often on the absurdity of the rules that had once seemed so oppressive, marveling at how tiny details, a tent, a garden decoration, the spacing of stones, had been transformed into instruments of control, and how their exposure had become the very means of liberation. And amid these reflections, a larger realization emerged: freedom, whether in one's backyard or in life at large, is not a given. It is earned, maintained, and sometimes fought for with both courage and meticulous attention. I began to invest more in my property, not as a statement, but as a reclamation, a demonstration that ownership and joy were inseparable when one refused to be intimidated. Friends and family returned to the space with renewed enthusiasm, drawn to the stories of confrontation, strategy, and eventual triumph. And the tent, the garden, the very yard itself became symbols, small yet potent, of resistance against pettiness and authoritarianism. Karen, in contrast, began to fade from the center of attention. Her attempts at intimidation, once a daily presence, were curtailed by the procedural oversight. She could no longer manipulate, and while she maintained her position nominally, her influence diminished, tempered by the awareness that residents were now watching, documenting, and prepared to push back. The social hierarchy that had made her seemingly untouchable was replaced by one in which accountability, transparency, and persistence mattered far more than unchecked authority. Looking back, I understood that the resolution was about far more than just reversing fines or reclaiming a backyard. It was about asserting the right to live without fear of arbitrary control, about proving that even the most entrenched systems of petty authority could be challenged and reshaped. The satisfaction of victory was intertwined with relief, pride, and the knowledge that months of careful documentation, measured responses, and unwavering resolve had not only preserved my autonomy, but also sent a message to the community that intimidation could not reign unchecked. In the weeks that followed, life began to normalize, but with a deeper appreciation for the fragility and value of personal freedom. Weekends were once again filled with laughter under the stars, the children ran freely, and evenings were punctuated with the crackle of campfires that no HOA notice could ever diminish. Every tent set up, every decoration placed, every small act of enjoyment became a quiet celebration. A reaffirmation that the right to one's property was inseparable from the ability to live fully and without fear. But beyond the physical reclaiming of space, the experience left an enduring mark on perspective and community consciousness. I had learned that preparation, documentation, and courage were powerful tools against oppression. That standing firm, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable authority, could catalyze meaningful change, and that the impact of one resolute individual could ripple outward, challenging the culture of fear that had governed far too many neighborhoods. The story of the conflict spread quietly at first, through conversations with neighbors and casual gatherings. But it quickly became emblematic of a larger truth: petty rules and overbearing authority only hold sway when passivity allows them to. When confronted with courage, clarity, and persistence, even the most rigid structures can bend, if not break. Over time, the board itself, shaken by exposure and newfound scrutiny, began implementing small reforms, clearer guidelines, fairer enforcement, and a more transparent system that ensured no resident would be subjected to the same arbitrary pressures I had endured. The subtle cultural shift was palpable. Residents were more willing to attend meetings, voice concerns, and expect accountability from those in positions of authority. And yet, even amid these changes, the personal transformation was the most profound. I found a renewed confidence in asserting boundaries, navigating conflict, and standing up for what was right, not out of defiance, but out of a fundamental belief in fairness, autonomy, and respect. The backyard, once a battlefield, had become a sanctuary, each corner a testament to perseverance and reclaimed joy, a tangible reminder that even in the most absurdly petty conflicts, agency could be preserved and dignity upheld. Friends would visit, drawn not just by the physical space, but by the story itself, a cautionary tale with a triumphant resolution that inspired laughter, disbelief, and admiration in equal measure. And while the scars of confrontation remained, an awareness of vulnerability, the memory of relentless scrutiny, they were accompanied by a profound sense of empowerment. I knew that I had not only defended my property, but had also rewritten the narrative, transforming a campaign of intimidation into a story of resistance, strategy, and ultimately, vindication. As months turned into years, the tent became symbolic, a small, simple structure that had once provoked absurd confrontation, but now represented freedom, resilience, and the victory of careful planning over arbitrary authority. The story served as a reminder that even in environments dominated by bureaucracy, pettiness, and overreach, persistence, courage, and careful documentation could carve a path to justice and autonomy. And as I stood in the yard one quiet evening, watching the children chase the golden retriever, the fire crackle softly in the background, and the stars twinkle overhead, a deep sense of satisfaction washed over me. The battle had been long, stressful, and at times overwhelming, but the outcome was undeniable: autonomy reclaimed, petty power diminished, and the joy of living without fear fully restored. It was a victory not measured in fines reversed or rules overturned, but in the affirmation that a person's right to enjoy their own property, their own life, could not be arbitrarily stripped away, that persistence and courage could withstand even the most oppressive of forces. And as I gazed across the backyard, now a place of laughter and life, rather than anxiety and conflict, I could not help but wonder. If one resolute homeowner could reclaim their freedom against such relentless opposition, how many other spaces, other lives, and other communities could be transformed when courage met injustice head-on. The story lingered, not as a tale of petty conflict, but as a testament to resilience, a reminder that freedom is worth defending, that authority is accountable, and that even in the most absurdly restrictive environments, the human spirit can triumph.